In this lecture, we'll be discussing measurement. How do we measure something that we're interested in studying? What makes a measure good? And how do you evaluate a measure as a reader? In the social sciences, which we're a part of as marriage and family therapists, we're typically interested in abstract constructs, things that we cannot directly measure. So things like relationship satisfaction, parenting competence, family communication. These are not things like height, weight, age, which we can directly measure and quantify very easily. So the first step in measuring in our field involves defining the construct or the phenomenon that we're interested in. So what exactly are we measuring? How do we define it? How would other people define it? And we have to make sure we're not measuring something that's similar but not the same thing. For example, let's say you're interested in creating a measure for therapeutic alliance. This is an abstract construct. So you would have to decide, how do you define therapeutic alliance? What is it? What isn't it? How is it different from other things that might be similar, such as progress in therapy? Once you've defined your construct, then you have to decide how you're going to measure it. And this is called operationalizing the construct. So in the social sciences, we use different indicators that are associated with phenomena. We use thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Now this should sound familiar because these are also things that we look at in therapy and when we're creating treatment plans. So you have to select indicators that align with how you have defined the construct. So if you've defined therapeutic alliance as a positive, trusting, effective relationship between the therapist and the client, then you'll define indicators from there. So for example, a thought that might help you measure therapeutic alliance might be, I think my therapist is helpful. A feeling that might be an indicator of therapeutic alliance could be, I trust my therapist. And a behavior that could be an indicator could be, I am honest with my therapist. Or you could even measure an observable behavior, such as attending therapy consistently. So your indicators have to align with how you have defined the construct. There are different ways of measuring these constructs. The most common is self-report. This is very typical if you've operationalized a construct through thoughts or feelings, because really the only way to measure thoughts and feelings is by asking the person to report them. Sometimes we'll do observation, and that's only typical if we can measure it through behavior. So we can measure how many times somebody comes to therapy. We can measure by observation whether they're on time. For more complicated behaviors, you might develop a coding system, such as how often eye contact is maintained or head nodding occurs or something like that. Observation requires a lot more time, money, and effort, so it's not as common. And then occasionally researchers will measure heart rate, stress hormones, blood components to look at physiological factors in these constructs. When you're creating a measure, you have to think about reactivity, and that is, how will people react to the process of being observed or assessed that might change the way they respond from what's really true. So the most common type of reactivity is social desirability, and that is where the person responding answers in a way that makes them look good. So if we're measuring therapeutic alliance and your client wants to appear like a good client, then they may answer in a way that makes them appear that way. Demand characteristics is similar, but in a different direction. Demand characteristics is when the participant answers in a way that makes the researcher look good, or in the way they think the researcher wants them to look. So if you're measuring therapeutic alliance with your clients, and your client answers in a way because they want you to look good, then that's a demand characteristic. And another common way that people react to instruments is by learning from them. So you might gain knowledge, skills, or information from a measure you're filling out, and then if you fill it out a second time, your answers may change because you've learned something the first time. So if a client's consistently answering questionnaires about therapeutic alliance, they may start to learn to look for different therapist behaviors or look for their own thoughts and feelings in session and become actually more attuned to them. And so then they may answer differently the next time because they learned from the instrument, not because their relationship has necessarily changed. Another thing to think about when creating an instrument is how sensitive it is so that it can detect meaningful differences between different individuals. So if one person has a low therapeutic alliance and another person has a really good therapeutic alliance, your measure should be able to tell the difference. Even better than that is if your measure can tell the difference from like an average therapeutic alliance to a slightly above average therapeutic alliance. That's additionally sensitive, so it's an even stronger measure. So there's different ways you look at sensitivity, and one is how many items do you have. So you can measure something with one question, but it's going to be more sensitive if you have multiple questions that are getting at the same construct. However, there's the point where your measure becomes too long and then people don't want to answer your questions. So there really isn't a magic formula for figuring out how many questions should be on a measure, but there are plenty of statistical tests that you can do to determine if a measure is sensitive and if it's a quality measure. Ceiling and floor effects is if your measure leads people to answer in a way where everyone's score is high or everyone's score is low. So if your questions are worded in such a way that everyone's going to answer in one way, then that could be a ceiling or a floor effect. Another thing to consider when creating a measurement or when evaluating a measurement is what is the level of measurement? What kind of data is being measured? This is very important, so make sure you pay attention to these categories and that you understand these categories because we will continue to discuss these concepts throughout the course. So there are two different kinds of data. There's categorical data and there's numerical data. And then within those, there are two subcategories. So nominal data is categorical data that cannot be ranked, where there is no inherent hierarchy or value to the choices. And typically, they are also mutually exclusive. For example, with marital status, there are different categories. It could have single, divorced, married, remarried, widowed. Those categories cannot be ranked. There's no inherent value to them. And they may be mutually exclusive, but they may not be. And this is very important when you're creating even clinic forms, that people have the option to choose as many responses as apply to them. So for marital status, somebody could be both single and divorced. So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. And if you want them to be mutually exclusive, then you'll have to create more specific categories. For example, changing single to single, never married would then make it mutually exclusive from divorced. Ordinal data is categorical data that is ranked or can be ranked, even though there isn't a specific value difference between the categories. So, for example, degrees, high school degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, doctoral degree, right? There is an inherent ranking there because one cannot be earned without the previous, but there isn't a set value difference between each degree. One just precedes the other. Likert scales are also ordinal data. So if you have a question where the response is from strongly disagree to strongly agree, those are categories. Those are labels for a response. I strongly disagree, I disagree, I'm neutral, and they're ranked. There is an inherent value to the order that they're put in. However, there's no meaningful difference between strongly disagreeing and strongly agreeing, right? There's no numerical value between that. There's a difference to me as a person, and there's a difference to you as a person, but we can't really quantify that difference in real life. However, researchers do this fun little trick where they turn Likert Scale data into interval data. So interval data is numerical data. So these we're using numbers. So it is ranked because numbers go in order, and there's an equal difference between the units. So the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as the difference between 2 and 3 and 4. An example of this would be degrees. Fahrenheit or Celsius, right? There's a difference between 20 degrees and 30 degrees is 10. The difference between 40 degrees and 50 degrees is 10. And 50 degrees is higher than 30 degrees. It's ranked. There's an equal difference between the units. So what researchers do with Likert scale and Likert scale information is they assign a numerical value to a Likert scale category. So on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, we'll give strongly disagree a 1, disagree a 2, neutral a 3, agree a 4, and strongly agree a 5. So what researchers do then is they give a numerical value to a category, and then they can do more advanced statistical analyses with it. However, we have to be careful with that because those numbers aren't real. There's nothing about strongly agree that is 5, right? And strongly agree isn't 4 more than strongly disagree, right? That's something that we've made up so that we can do analyses. So it's something you'll want to pay attention to because that's the most common kind of measurement that we use in family therapy research. And lastly, ratio data is numerical data, just like interval, and the only difference is it has a meaningful 0 point. There is an actual 0. Example of this would be income. If your income is $0, that is a real thing. Number of children, 0 children is a real thing. On the Kelvin scale of temperature, there is a true 0, right? Age, 0. You're actually not alive. However, if we think about IQ, there's no real 0. There's no 0 point of no IQ, right? And on these Likert scales, if I assign a 0 to something, that it doesn't mean anything on the scale. There's no 0 agreement. There's no absence of agreement or disagreement. Most of the time we will be using interval, ordinal, or nominal data. So if ratio data confuses you a little, that's okay. The important thing to remember is the 0 real or not? And we'll keep talking about this. Once you've created a measure, or once a researcher has created a measure, you then have to evaluate it. And we evaluate measures in 2 categories, reliability and validity. So reliability asks the question, does this instrument give a consistent answer? Because if you're measuring the same construct and you've operationalized it properly, your measure should give the same results every time by every observer. So internal reliability calculates how the items vary together. For example, if a measure is supposed to assess marital satisfaction, then you expect each item to measure marital satisfaction. So the items should vary together. That is, if someone is very satisfied, you expect all of their answers will be pretty high. If someone isn't, you'd expect all of their answers to be very low. If one item doesn't vary with the rest of the data, for example, if somebody's answering all 4s and 5s, and then there's a 1 or a 2, it may not be measuring the same construct. So something to look into. Stability, or test-retest reliability, is a construct that says if your construct should be stable, like your IQ or your birthday, then if I continue to test it and retest it, it should give the same answer. Another example is if I ask you, what is your date of birth? Your answer will likely be the same each time. However, if I ask you, when is your birthday? You could give me a bunch of different answers and they could change. You could say your actual date of birth. You may just say the month and the day, or you could say next week. So if asking when is your birthday does not have a lot of stability to it. So you'd want to get more specific and ask a question like, what is your date of birth? Because then you're going to get the same response every time. And inter-observer reliability is just if you're using observers to code behaviors, that measures whether people are coding the same way. So it lets us know if you're coding and your measure is good. What I want you to get from this slide, are we measuring what we think we're measuring, is that there is always measurement error. There will always be a difference between what is really happening and what we can measure, because most of our measures are indirect. We can only know what somebody tells us. So there will always be random measurement error. It's a natural part of measuring human beings. And then sometimes there's measurement error that is systematic, which means it's due to weaknesses in our measures. And I'm going to talk about validity next, which is another way to strengthen measures and make sure that we're measuring what we think we're measuring. So remember, reliability asks, does the instrument give a consistent response? And validity asks, does the instrument measure what it's supposed to measure? So a very simple form of validity is face validity. And that is, if I look at this questionnaire, does it look like it's measuring therapeutic alliance? Are there questions on here about therapy, about your therapist, about how you feel about therapy? Or are there questions on here about something that may have nothing to do with it? Content validity, are we measuring everything that comprises the construct? And are we missing anything? So you could have a measurement on therapeutic alliance and you never ask about trust, right? That could be a key part of therapeutic alliance that would be missing and would lower the content validity of your measure. There are lots of kinds of validity, but what's most important to think about is predictive validity is important because prediction is often a goal for research or for treatment. So if you design a measure that can predict behaviors, you've designed a very useful measure, right? And if you have a measurement in clinical treatment that can predict how somebody might do in therapy, predict whether a couple will stay together, that can also be a very useful tool for treatment. One of the ways that we measure validity is by looking at convergent or discriminant. So does this measure correlate well with measures that it should? And does it correlate poorly when it shouldn't? Right? So for example, if you have a measure of therapeutic alliance, you would expect that that would correlate with other measures of therapeutic alliance. And you might expect it to not correlate with a measurement of anything that doesn't have anything to do with therapeutic alliance, right? A measurement of relationship satisfaction with a partner. That shouldn't have anything to do with therapeutic alliance. So it shouldn't correlate with that because they shouldn't be related. Overall, the ways to increase the reliability and the validity of any instrument is by asking questions or giving instructions very intentionally and very carefully. As you can probably imagine, language is a very important part of measurement. So how we define a construct, how we ask questions about it, making sure that our prompts are clear and that they can be meaningful to all different kinds of people, that's how you make a really good measure. And so in class, we'll take a look at some measures that talk about their reliability and validity, talk about how the questions are worded, what they're measuring, and you'll also get an opportunity to create your own.